All right. So, we're going to go ahead and start up our Bible study again. For those of you who may not recall, the last few Bible studies that we did were on the end times and the preparing for the night hour. Um, I It's been a while since I did any Bible studies, but I wanted to touch base with everyone again because I wanted to pick up on this study today, which is technically a in addition to the end times according to Jesus, except that it's not so much about end times prophecy necessarily. This Bible study today is going to be specifically about the resurrection. And so we're going to approach this a little bit different from what we normally would hear. We're not going to go into um, just every single uh, diatribe of resurrection passages about Jesus and the proof of the resurrection. I'm not going to go that route today. What we are going to do, however, um, we are going to touch on uh, the specifics about the resurrection, especially as it relates to uh, to to the previous teachings that I taught on the rapture and the gathering of the saints to him, because I think that there are some minor details, and I want us to make sure that especially in the study that we're going to touch on is to get a better become better acquainted with the concept of the resurrection. And part of the reason for that is because I don't really know that believers understand the importance of knowing in detail aspects about the resurrection and why we need to really grasp those truths. Um, in my notes here, I wrote some questions in the introduction, like, do we really understand all that entails the resurrection? How do we know that it will occur and or when will it occur, right? Where does the concept of the resurrection actually originate from? Like, where does it come from, right? Because we read the New Testament and there's this, line of thought that is already pre-existing the New Testament with regard to the resurrection, although you can tell from the New Testament that there's a lot of questions that people are asking. Questions like, when the Pharisees came to Jesus and, they start trying to trick him by asking him about a woman who marries and has no children, and then her husband dies, and his brother takes her to be his wife, and there's seven brothers in total. They all die, and eventually the woman dies. And the question that they ask is, in the resurrection, who will have her to wife, seeing that they all had her in life. And so, there are questions. Now, obviously, their intention with that question was to entrap Jesus, but Jesus didn't fall for it. Nevertheless, those are questions that people were asking, and that for a lot of people was a conundrum in the days of the New Testament. So, um, this, a lot of us don't realize also that our faith rises and falls with the resurrection. Okay. And when you put that into perspective, that's a pretty dangerous and bold statement. I mean, if you think about it, the resurrection, if it's not real, if it didn't actually happen, if the dead do not rise, then everything that we believe as Christians is brought into question. Not only about Jesus' own resurrections, but also the hope that we have, right? Our salvation, everything literally hinges on the resurrection being real and something that we can attest to for the validity of our faith. So I, I decided to start the Bible study with, asking a question of where the idea of the resurrection comes from. Um, And the reason for that is that I wanted to start with that is because what a lot of people may not realize is that in the Jewish religion, okay, in Jewish thought, now I'm not talking about believers, okay, in Christ. I'm talking about Jewish people who are not Christian, all right? Um, the Old Testament does not put a lot of emphasis on the afterlife. The hereafter when it comes to our existence. I mean, you can draw from passages in the Old Testament to make a case for it, but in general, Jewish theology does not focus a lot on heaven and hell, and it doesn't focus on even discussions about the resurrection, but it does focus a lot about this life and the here and now. Um, One of the scholars that I quoted says, and this is from a gentleman by the name of Robert Mark and Eckhart. It's actually part of a Bible dictionary, and this is what they said. When one reads the Old Testament, one fact is striking, that Israel is attached to life, to this life, and in no way dreams of a marvelous life hereafter. Israel considers the world into which she has been placed as the handiwork of her God, and human existence is a divine gift. The Israelite wishes to see his days prolonged in the manner of the patriarchs, at the heart of the country entrusted to his people. That's a pretty, wild statement because when you get to the New Testament, we see a lot of dialogue that doesn't seem to coincide with what we just, what I just quoted to you in terms of, that because in truth, the reality of those things was really introduced by the Messiah. He's the one who emphasized these aspects, which, by the way, it's not uncalled for because, you know, um, there are there there are rabbis and rabbinic sayings that when the Messiah comes, he will interpret the law, he will interpret all things, right? And so there's this tradition just inherent in Jewish culture that the Messiah will teach and expound on the law and on everything that has been written. But uh, the idea of the afterlife is really a much heavier focus in the New Testament, with Jesus introducing these concepts in a much heavier gradient. Um, so, where's the foundational teaching in the Old Testament that addresses a subject like the resurrection? There technically isn't any. I mean, we can put together verses to try to make a case, but there's no chapter that says this is what the resurrection will be, or this is how, it gives you some examples of situations, and it gives you little vignettes of what could be expected, but it doesn't go into really deep detail um, about the resurrection. It's often mostly by inference, at least in the Old Testament, right? Um, so the idea of the resurrection, it doesn't really begin in the New Testament. It actually does begin in the Old Testament, okay? Um, and I would like to call the resurrection a singularity, okay? Because it is a major event. It is a major event in our collective theology. And so, and our hope rests on it. So, um, one thing that I would like to kind of I would like to go over some of the verses that can, especially in the Old Testament, that can actually refer to either a physical or an emblematic concept of a resurrection. And among those is Job chapter 19, uh, verses 25 to 27. Uh, Rick, if you can bring that up for us so we can, and somebody can please read, I would appreciate it. Rick, you want to go ahead and read that?
Yeah, sorry, I just realized I'm the only one that can talk.
Yeah.
25, 27, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Job 19,
Um,
25 through 27.
for I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another, how my heart yearns within me.
So this here is one of those passages in the Old Testament that can be a direct reference to a resurrection. All right. However, the way it's written, it doesn't come across as if it's a teaching. It's just something, it's almost as if it's the opinion of the writer. You know, the that he's saying, well, I know I'm going to see God, right, in my flesh, even though my skin wastes away, even though my skin, even though my body deteriorates, I'm going to see him in my flesh. It doesn't say that it's going to happen after he dies. It just the way it's worded kind of creates a little bit of a question there. The next one I'd like to go to is Psalm chapter 49, verse 15. All right, and I'll read down when it says, "But God will redeem my soul from the power of the grave, for he shall receive me, Selah." Right? So again, God will redeem my soul from the power of the grave, but does that necessarily mean a resurrection? Well, that could certainly be implied to mean that. Okay. Ezekiel chapter 37, and this one is a long one. This one's verses 1 through 14. And I'll go ahead and read that. Um, the hand of the Lord came upon me and brought me out of the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the midst of the valley, and it was full of bones. And he caused me to pass all around, and behold, there were many in the valley, in the open valley, and indeed they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? And so I answered, O Lord God, you know. And again he said to me, Prophesy to these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. It says, O Lord God, to these bones, surely I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live, and I will put sinews on you, and bring flesh on you to cover you, and put them in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a noise, and suddenly a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to bone. Indeed, I looked, and the sinews and the flesh came upon them, and the skin covered them over, and there was no breath in them. And I said, Prophesy to these. And he said to me, Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, son of man, and say to the breath, Thus saith the Lord God, Come from the four winds, O breath, breathe upon these slain that they may live. And so I prophesied, and he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived and stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. And he said to me, Son of man, these bones the whole house of Israel, and they indeed say, Our bones are dry, our hope is lost, and ourselves are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves, and will cause you to come up from your graves, and bring you into the land of Israel. And then you shall know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up from the graves. And I will put my spirit in you, and you shall live, and I will place you in your own land, and you shall know that I am the Lord, and I have spoken it and performed it. And again, these passages seem to give a description of what looks like a resurrection, but when you really pay attention to these verses, it doesn't actually describe a resurrection. It's using the resurrection template, if I can say it that way, to give you a model for the scattered children of Israel around the world and God bringing them back into the land. So it's not referring to a physical resurrection of a body, but it is referring to the resurrection of the nation in terms of it being returned into its own land. However, I would like to point out that he is using language that is specific in that it is describing what might very well be a very descriptive uh, explanation of what the resurrection might actually look like. But again, passage is really figurative, is not literal. Okay. Another one is Hosea chapter 6, the first two verses, verses 1 and 2. And so, Rick, if you could read those two verses, that'd be great.
Come and let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. And 2 days he will revive us. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight.
Okay. So again, this is figurative language. It's not referring to a physical resurrection. However, this is one of those passages that gives us a pattern that a resurrection is affiliated with a third day concept. And so, Jesus, we know that he was resurrected after the third day. So, when we look at these passages about the resurrection, um, or at least the things associated with the third day is always very special on God's calendar. In previous Bible studies, we've mentioned how that um, in the creation account, which by the way, we are going to get into the creation account today as well. In the creation account, God labels every day, you know, that he blessed this day, right? So on day one, he blessed it. However, on the second day, he doesn't bless it. But on the third day, he blesses it twice. So he says it's good twice. Nothing good was said on the second day, but it says it twice on the third day. And he does the same thing on the next set of three. So on the sixth day, which is the second set of threes, he says it's good twice again. So the third day has a very um, interesting connection to a double blessing. And the resurrection is, in fact, a blessing. It's a huge uh, event that implies a great deal of blessing for God's people. Okay. Um, so these are some of the verses that we've read in the Old Testament that seem to indicate a possible physical resurrection, but in reality, most of these that we've read thus far are more figurative. Okay. But the next set of verses I want to talk about are actually more direct when it comes to the physical bodily resurrection for humanity. All right. So let's go to Daniel chapter 12, and we're going to read verses 2 to 3. So, Rick, if you can go ahead and bring us to that passage, Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. All right, and I'll go ahead and read it. And it says, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall arise and shine. Shall those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." This is one of those passages that directly addresses a physical bodily resurrection of the saints, of the believers. All right. The next one is Psalm chapter 16, verses 8 through 10. And this is actually one of those verses, if I'm not mistaken. This is one of those verses that is actually a prophecy about the Messiah. Okay. So I want you to read the language, and I want you to notice how even the biblical writers of the New Testament directly look at this verse and say, okay, this is talking about a physical resurrection. So in verses 8 through 10, and I'll read it, it says, "I have set the Lord always before me because he is at my right hand, and I shall not be moved. Therefore, my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will rest in hope, for you will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption." So this is a direct reference to God's anointed, okay? God to the Holy One, okay? That he will not leave his soul in hell and that he will not allow his Holy One to see corruption. So at some point, there is uh, a reference to him going down into Sheol or hell, okay? So he descends into hell, which from a theological perspective, that implies death, bodily death. But then it says, but you will not allow your Holy One to see corruption, which means that in the state of death, he won't stay in that state long enough for the body to start to decompose. So there's not illusion, but this imagery that is directly referencing and something that is clearly language associated with the resurrection. But again, I want you to notice how that it's not a completely straightforward text, but you have to extrapolate that just by reading the logical, you know, conclusion from one to the next. The next one would be Isaiah chapter 26, verse 19. Now, this one is really important for us because it actually deals with us directly. Okay? So, Rick, if you could please do me a favor, if you could read that last one in Isaiah chapter 26, verse 19.
Your dead shall live, together with my dead body they shall arise. Awake and sing, you who dwell in dust, for your dew is like the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast out the dead.
Okay. Now, what's interesting, uh, the reason why this is actually referring to us in specifics, okay, is because of the teaching that I did on on the end times according to Jesus, where I talked about the rapture. The very next verse in verse 20 is one of those verses where you have that rapture language come like it was in John chapter 4 verse I'm sorry Revelation chapter 4 verse 1 where he says come up here. You know, over here we have the same kind of command, come my people and enter into your chambers and shut the door behind you, hide yourself as it were for a little moment until the indignation is past. So this is again a veiled reference to the time of the indignation. Now, I would say that the indignation is most likely the wrath of God that is coming, and that's most likely at the halfway midpoint of the tribulation period, right? That's technically when the wrath of God comes in, is at the halfway point of that 7 year period. Um, but again, I want you to notice that you know for us, you know, we're gonna be, you know, escaping a great deal of things before even any of that happens. So there's a lot that we can dwell on for this, but I just wanted to bring it out there that this is important specifically for us because, you know, there's a blessing for those who overcome and those who don't necessarily overcome but are still, you know, believers. You have, you know, a chance to escape the indignation that's coming. The better thing is to go up in the first group. So, but anyway, the next series of examples is examples of people who had died in the Old Testament and were brought back to life. Those would be 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 17 through 24. And this is specifically about Elijah and the widow's son. Okay. And for this one here, now let me read this. And it says, now it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, and his sickness was so serious that there was no breath left in him. So she said to Elijah, what have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to bring me to, I'm sorry, to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son? And he said to her, "Give me your son." So he took him out of her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying and laid him on his own bed. And when he had cried out to the Lord and said, "O Lord, my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge by killing her son?" And he stretched himself out 3 times on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord and said, "O Lord, my God, I pray, let the child's soul come back to him." And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back into him, and he revived. So this here is the woman's widow's son is being revived, having been dead. Okay, now it's not the same thing as a resurrection that the people who have died for prolonged periods of time and their bodies have basically become dust or disappeared or become animal food, whatever it is that it's a little different. But again, it is an example of life returning to the body and the body being revived. The next one is a similar story, but this one's in Second Kings chapter 4, verses 18 through 37. And this one is about Elisha. Now, Elisha succeeded Elijah in his ministry. Okay. And so in this case, Elisha raises a Shunammite woman's son. Okay. And this is from verses 18 through 37. Uh, and again, I'm not gonna read this whole thing just because I want you guys to understand that there are examples that were similar in Elijah and both Elisha's ministry, um, in which a woman had a son who was dead, and the child was revived. Okay. The next one I'd like to one actually is related to Elisha, and in this one is in Second Kings chapter 13. All right. So in Second Kings chapter 13, verses 20 through 21. It says, Then Elisha died. So the prophet Elisha is dead, and then they buried him. And the raiding bands from Moab invaded the land in the spring of the year. So it was, as they were burying a man, that suddenly they spied a band of raiders. And they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. I'm assuming they didn't know this, okay? And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. Now, that I wish they put in a movie because I think that that would be really funny to see these guys that knew this guy was dead and they laid his body, and the moment his body touches uh, the bones of Elisha, suddenly he becomes back alive. Anyway, so uh, well, a lot of you may not see about the whole story about Elisha in this that um, Elisha had he was dead at this point. It doesn't but I want you to kind of see a little bit of the things happening behind the scenes about this because Elisha started his ministry by taking the mantle that was left behind by Elijah when Elijah was taken up in a chariot of fire. Well, he had told Elijah because Elijah said, "Hey, I want you. I'm about to go. The Lord is going to take me. So why don't you ask anything so that I can grant it to you?" And so Elisha, he scratches his beard. He's like, All right, I know what I want. I want a double portion of your spirit." And Elijah looks at him and goes, that's a hard one. I'll tell you what, if you can see me being taken up in a chariot, if you see me being taken, then your request is granted to you. And so he's like, okay. So he goes ahead and they keep going. Suddenly the chariot comes and he gets in. Elijah's taken away, and Elisha sees it happening. And when after he leaves, he takes his mantle and he comes to the river and just like Elijah had done before. He takes the mantle and he strikes the water. Nothing happens. And he says, "Where's the God of Elijah?" So he hits it again, and then the waters part and is able to cross. And that was the first miracle. Well, the thing is that if you read the story of Elijah, Elijah had 7 miracles that were recorded. However, when you go into uh, when you go into the story of Elisha, he actually had 13 in his lifetime. And so, but his request was that he might have double that of Elijah. Well, after he's dead, Elisha, his bones are in that grave, and the guy who is placed in the tomb of Elisha, the moment he touches his bones, he comes to life, and then the guy comes alive. And so that technically becomes the 14th miracle of Elisha. However, if you think about this, okay, that meant that God was still honoring Elisha's request as if Elisha was still active with God. Now we know from the text that Elisha was dead. His bones were there. I mean, it wasn't like he was a cadaver. He was bones. All right, there were bones inside the tomb. So the fact that God still honored Elisha, it kind of tells you that from God's perspective, Elisha lives with him. Elisha in the afterlife, as if we could say, God is honoring Elisha even in after death, in the afterlife, right? And so this is one of those little nuances in the Old Testament where God honors him. And it kind of, if you think forward into the New Testament, Jesus, when he was talking about the resurrection, he says that all those that have died that are righteous, they all live unto him. They all live unto God. Even though they physically die, they live unto God. And this is one of those passages where you can extrapolate that from the Old Testament. You know, it's veiled and it seems a little bit, like it's not actually a direct reference to that, but it is in fact one of those verses that you can extrapolate that concept because Elisha was in fact dead, physically dead, and yet God honored uh, his prayer from before he died as if Elisha was still active. So um, it's just one of those interesting little tidbits of information. Um, so with all of these verses that we just looked at, right? There's uh, uh, there's still a question. I mean, where does this all really come from? Where does the idea of the resurrection, where can we extrapolate that information from? Um, I would say, and for the purposes of this Bible study, that the concept of the resurrection has everything to do with three major things, the major truths, okay, that most of us don't readily associate with the resurrection. The first is the nature of God. The second, the character of God. And three, the creation of mankind or humanity. Okay? So we're going to explore some of this today because I want you guys to kind of start reaching back into your memories because we did talk about, remember, we had originally started this whole, Bible study group when we got into the Godhead and we started talking about the nature of God and how God really is, right? So, the if you remember, if you recall from those Bible studies, the very major distinction of God is that God is invisible. He has no body. He is formless. he is literally invisible, all right? And he cannot be approached because he's that different from everything else that exists. Okay. Um, but be that as it may, he did create a physical universe, regardless of the fact that he has no physicality to his being. He created a physical universe into which he chose to include elements that were conducive to revealing him, whether that was in patterns, whether that was in specific life, forms of life that he created, like hence mankind. All right. But he basically uh, he put himself in a creation, or he create made a creation where he himself can be revealed, and he created humans with bodies that were tailor made for that purpose. Okay. He created humans to have bodies that are basically the only appropriate functional vessels to exercise God's stated purpose for man, which is dominion. All right. And so humans are or created by God with bodies that are part of the creation. If you remember, God specifically says that he says, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air." And he creates mankind, and it says that God formed him from the dust of the earth. He formed his body, and he breathed into his nostrils, and man became a living soul. And he said that this being is the being that is to have dominion over the creation. Okay. Now, here's the thing. When there is no body, okay, that creates a barrier for God's lawful interaction. All right. And the reason why I'm going to say that is this. All right. God is God. He can do whatever he wants. Okay. But God is not capricious. God fulfills his own will. Okay. And he never violates his word. Okay. So for when he created mankind and he gave dominion to man, he did so omitting himself from the equation. Okay. So when he creates mankind, he causes a a barrier that just is created by his own will. God wanted it to be done this way because he created mankind in his image, in his own image, and after his likeness, so that we can manifest the invisible God, that we can reveal him, okay, within the creation. And we are the most efficient vessels for that, okay? And by creating the human race the way he did, it provides God with lawful access according to the rules that he himself set up. He set that up. That isn't something that man created, it's something that God created himself. When he created man, he says, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion." He never said, "Let us have dominion with them." He said, "Let them have dominion." Well, the moment he does that, God being spirit, who that has no body, that has no form, okay, can no longer interact in the creation unless he has a human created in his image and likeness that will agree with him to do what he wants to do. And all throughout history, God does things through humanity, through man. As a matter of fact, there's a really wild verse in the Old Testament where it says that God will do nothing except that which he first reveals to the servants, the prophets. God will do nothing except what he first reveals to his servants, the prophets. So there's well, the things that God does has so much invested in mankind that the creation of man is imperative. It's absolutely essential for what God desires. Okay. Um, the next component, and I mentioned the first being the nature, the second one being the character of God, and this is where we can see. certain elements that we know about God. The first being in Titus chapter 1, verse 2, okay, where it says that God cannot lie, right? That means that anything that he says, the moment it comes out of his mouth, right? The moment his word proceeds from him, he can't go back on it. He can't change what he says. So when he says something, that word is himself in the context of communication. And therefore, for him to contradict his word would be the same as contradicting himself. And if he did, all of creation would literally dismantle. Okay? God would cease to exist. Everything would cease to exist. So God cannot lie. That's number one. Number two, God cannot change. This is another thing about the character of God. He is immutable. All right. God isn't fickle. He doesn't, change his thoughts like, oh, I think I'm going to be like this today. Oh, no, there's a lot of so-called deities in the world, all right, who are fickle like that, who are capricious and they can change at the whim. They can be one way and then suddenly they change. There's a lot of religions that do believe in that sort of thing. Islam being one of them. Okay, the God of Islam is capricious. He is very fickle in that he can change at any moment, and they see that as an example of power. Whereas the God of the Bible is very different. He says, "No, I change not, and therefore you are not consumed. You sons of Jacob are not consumed." Okay, so and that's in Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, and that's really important because that tells us that the promises of God are going to be fulfilled regardless. All right. Because even when we are unfaithful, God is still faithful. Even in death, we have hope. Okay. Because God continues to do his thing. Just like Elisha. Elisha asked for a double portion. He dies. He died without seeing number 14. But yet God fulfilled his promise to him by, raising the guy from the dead. Um, And the third thing with regards to the character of God is that God keeps his promises. Okay? The fact that we can have hope in the resurrection is because God does fulfill his promises. He keeps everything. We might have fickle memory of our own. Okay? We could be very forgetful. We could not even remember what God said. But God doesn't forget. And he wants to keep his promises because every promise that he gives has ramifications for his fulfillment. So even if we don't get it, he's going to do it. And anytime he makes a promise, it's really to our benefit. It's not just for his benefit, it's for our benefit. Okay? It's for his glory and our benefit. So in the character of God, you have that God cannot lie, God cannot change, and God keeps his promises. Okay? The next section now is the creation of man. Now, this is the third element. Okay. Remember, God's nature, God's character, and the creation of humanity. All right. So in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27, and chapter 2, verses 21 through 22, we have the creation of man, where God says, again, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air, and so on and so forth, right? And then he puts man to sleep at some point, and he takes a rib from his side and he makes Eve. And in that process of doing that, he is creating this new race of being that is tailor-made and designed to rule. All right. Now, the part about that creation that I want us to focus that actually comes really gets into this realm of the resurrection is where it helps us to understand now that we have this background about God's nature and God's character coming in now to the creation of man, you're going to see why the resurrection is so necessary. All right. When man was created by God, man was never meant to die. Okay, the God set some stipulations and he said, you know, you can eat of every tree that is in the midst of the garden, but the tree he said you can eat of every tree in the garden, but the tree that is in the midst of the garden, that is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat of it. Okay? For in the day that you eat of it, you will die. Right? So their life was contingent upon them obeying that one command not to eat from that tree. That means that humanity was to be immortal. Man was created with God's intention for him to live forever. And in living forever, he is to exercise dominion forever. Okay? Death was an interruption into that whole process. Did God incorporate that into his plan? Yes, but that's not what he wants. Okay? What God wants is to make humanity be with him forever. But when the moment, remember, the moment that he created mankind and gave mankind dominion, he omitted himself from the process and had to create an environment in which the framework for his plan could be fulfilled in spite of there being humans that would rebel against him. So, but when man dies, okay, that death again is an interruption of that blessing. So, what we see in the resurrection is that God is, through the resurrection, reinstating man into that position of eternal life, of no longer being corrupted, of basically bringing us back, except that it's not that we're going back to an old creation. He's bringing us back, but by via a new creation. And that is where the resurrection plays a major role. Okay. Uh, so I'm reading my notes here. I wrote down here that since God, and this is basically putting everything together, okay? Since God cannot lie, and since God cannot change, and since God keeps his promises, then everything that he intended for man remains in the forefront of God's own mind. Even if we forgot about it, God didn't forget. That's what God intended for man from the beginning. The resurrection is to bring back God's original intent to have a human race that cannot die, that can live forever. Okay? That is infused with immortality. And since man was blessed with dominion, it is man who must continue to exercise that dominion. Man has to do that. But in order to do that effectively and the way God intended, death or the curse has to be reversed somehow so that God's original intent for mankind can actually continue where it left off. And it's basically a matter of logic. If God promised it, then man must fulfill it, right? Even when the plans seem to get interrupted, God demonstrated his willingness by all of these examples that he gave us, like Elisha's bones, right? And the body that fell on him, right? God completed the double portion even after Elisha's death, right? Because God's intention is that God will fulfill his word. One way or another, God will fulfill his word. The resurrection is the mechanism by which God is going to make his intentions to be fulfilled. Right? The prophets in the Old Testament, later on, they wrote about how what God always wanted for humanity was that to have humanity or mankind in fellowship with him. God wants that. Now, that is what God intended. This is why when you think about where does how does the concept of the resurrection come in the Bible? It comes from the express intent of our creation. That God, when He He created us to live forever. The resurrection is the means by which that intention will be fulfilled again. Okay? And so let's get into some of the mechanics of the resurrection. Okay? So that we can explain exactly what the resurrection is. Because for those of us who are Christians, all right, and most people don't even ask us about the resurrection because they don't know to ask, and most Christians don't even know how to answer appropriately. But um, if somebody asks you, what is the resurrection? This is the answer that you should probably give, okay? It is the process by which something or someone that is dead is brought back to life, okay? And we're not talking about resuscitation. We're not talking about doing CPR. We're talking about someone that is dead, possibly buried, or even to the point of decay or faded out into, into history, right? Your bones are all that's left, or maybe not even that. Okay. Maybe you got eaten by lions and you ended up being lion poop. All right. Doesn't matter what it is. All right. Resurrection is when something or someone that is dead is brought back to life again. So, biblically speaking, it is the restoration of life to a physical body being returned to a living state despite the conditions of death. Okay. That means that it doesn't matter if you died of old age. It doesn't mean if you died prematurely from birth. It doesn't matter if you died from natural causes or from, murder, or if you were killed in war, or if you were killed by some wild beast. It doesn't, or if you drowned in the sea and all thousands of little fish ate your body parts until you were gone. Okay. It does not matter how a person dies. What matters is that the person will come back to life. Um, I didn't put this in my notes, but I do recall Chuck Missler years ago had mentioned that scientists discovered that because mankind was made from the soil, it says that God uh, formed man, his body, from the dust of the earth, and in that because of that, that the soil contains a number of the minerals and everything that is needed in that is actually found in our bodies. It's actually from the soil, and our bodies have it. Okay. And one of the interesting things about the resurrection is that God doesn't need to have the original body. All he needs is the original elements that put together form a body. God, all he has to do is put them in the right sequence, and he can make a new body from the same elements that were made before. So, as far as our physical bodies are concerned, how we die is not nearly as impressive as how God puts us back together. Okay. That is something that I want to kind of just throw out there because a lot of people have questions. Well, how are you going to die if you were cremated or, if were died in some other way? Well, that's basically God doesn't need to have the the same body to resurrect it. All he needs is the elements that are already in the earth. Because the moment you die, your body, right, your spirit goes back to the one who gave it, but your body goes back to the dust. So even, regardless of how you died, eventually it goes back to the dust. Well, all your information came from the dust, and that's all God needs to raise up a body. Okay? It's just a matter of him putting putting into certain sequence the information in the soil to put the body back together. All right. So the resurrection is not a spiritual like raising. It is a physical one. That is probably the most important aspect of the teaching of the resurrection is that it is not just a spiritual thing. It is a physical one. There is a physical change in the body where the body is being brought to life. There's a literally a physical raising. That is the resurrection. Okay. Now, we read earlier, one of the first verses that we read that was a direct reference to a bodily or physical resurrection was in Daniel. Okay. Now, I believe that was in Daniel. Let's see here. Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 to 3. And this is one of those passages where you see that some that the dead are going to be raised, that some will be raised to everlasting righteousness, and the others are going to be raised into everlasting shame and contempt. So you see the raising of both the righteous and the wicked in that one verse from Daniel chapter 12. Okay. The thing what a lot of people overlook is that in that one passage in Daniel, it says that some will rise to righteousness, others will rise to shame, right? In that one verse, the book of Revelation gives us an interesting insight because it tells us in Revelation chapter 20 verse 5 a really interesting detail. Rick, if you could do me a favor, bring up Revelation chapter 20, verse 5, real quick, because I want people to read this because this is in direct reference to what Daniel says, right? It says, "But the rest of the dead," this is after the righteous, okay, are resurrected. Verses 4 talks about the righteous being raised, but then, okay, it says, "But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished." This is the first resurrection, right? The resurrection of the righteous is the first resurrection, but the resurrection of the rest of the people who are not righteous, so this is the resurrection of the wicked, that's 1,000 years later, which means that in the book of Daniel, that one verse that talks about the resurrection of the righteous and the resurrection of the wicked, there's actually 1,000 year gap between those two events. If you incorporate these verses in Revelation 20, that there's a huge difference in how those things are going to be played out. It's not it's all simultaneously the way you assume when just reading Daniel, but when you get to Revelation, you realize, oh, wait a minute, there's phases. There's a first resurrection according to Revelation 20, and then there's another one that happens 1,000 years later. So these are details that you really need to grasp because the resurrection proper the when you really put it into the context that the New Testament puts it in, the Old Testament as well, okay, is that the resurrection is a mechanism of or a platform for judgment. That's why when you look at the principles of the doctrine of Christ, the very last two of the principles are resurrection from the dead and eternal judgment, right? Those last two of the principles of the doctrine of Christ they're coupled together in that sense because they're related to one leads to the other. Okay. And the resurrection, and this is one of those things that you may not have heard before. All right. The resurrection is categorized into those two groups. The first being for the righteous. All right. And the second or the last resurrection is for the wicked. Now, the one caveat that is the same for both is that when we are all gathered to be with him, that's the first resurrection. This is really important. And it's the same thing applies to the wicked when all the wicked are gathered before him. So the main difference for the righteous and the wicked is that the righteous are gathered to be with him. The wicked are gathered before him. Okay? We are gathered to be with him. They are gathered before him for judgment. So those two categories, the first and the last resurrection. But the stipulation is that in order for the resurrection to be categorized a resurrection, it has to be all together. Okay? So the stipulation about the resurrection is that the gathering must be completed prior to the resurrection being declared official. Now, how can I say that? Well, it's very simple. Jesus said about himself, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Jesus, he died and he was buried. And in 3 days, he rose again. And on the day of his resurrection, a bunch of saints from the Old Testament arose with him. But that was not the first resurrection. This is really important. That was not the first resurrection. According to Revelation, the first resurrection is when all the saints from all of time are gathered together. When those that have died and rose, and those that have died since and that are alive now, and that will be when all of the righteous are finally gathered before God, brought to life physically, that is the first resurrection. All right. That means that all of the gatherings of people beforehand, the catching away or raptures, which occur prior to the resurrection being completed, are nothing more than a collection, the collections of the saints. That's what those are. The rapture, the pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, all of that are the phases of collecting the saints, from those who have died to those that are alive, even until the end. Once that is done, once they are collected, that is the first resurrection. But there's another resurrection that comes 1,000 years later. That is technically not called a second, but it's technically the last. All right, because you have a first and a second, but the second one is the last. It's not category, it doesn't call it that, but we know that there's not going to be any more death after this. So once this whole end time scenario gets completed and finished, death and hell are both cast into the lake of fire. There will never be death or decay again. That will no longer be a part of any equation from that point forward. So whatever that last resurrection is with of the wicked, whatever that one is, that is the last one, right? Because there will be no more death, forthcoming from there from that point forward. Uh, the gathering of us to him is not the resurrection proper, right? Like when it comes to the rapture, or when it comes to the people with Jesus when he rose from the dead. But the rapture itself, all right, the gathering together, like in the rapture, it's a resurrection of sorts, right? Just like Jesus' own rising and the saints that came together with him. But again, they were not called the first resurrection. The first resurrection applies when everyone is gathered from all time. Okay? When everyone is risen and once everyone is participated in the rising and gathered before him, that's when the first resurrection is called out. All right? So the second or the last resurrection, it happens only after the millennium or only after 1,000 years after the righteous or after the first resurrection. And this is categorized only after everyone is gathered before him for judgment. All of the wicked, right? So the resurrection of the wicked is also a singular event, but it will happen after all of the wicked are raised up. That's the last. That's the last. They have to be raised up and they're going to be cast into hell or into the lake of fire. Sorry. Right? Because even hell itself will be cast into a lake of fire. So this is again, I want you guys to keep this in mind that when it comes to the resurrection, the categorization of the resurrection, it only applies upon the ingathering of all of each of those two groups. The moment it's all gathered, at that point, that's considered the first resurrection. Now, and we got a little bit more to go, and it's 10 o'clock, but I think we can finish this up. Okay. Um, Rick, do you think we should stop this right here so we can maybe pick this up later?
Sure, if you want to. I mean, it's going to be more than one session, you said, right?
I mean, it could be more than one session. Yeah, we can do that. Let's do it. Let's close it here for now, just so we can make it a point of, not putting all this information on one video. We can set it up into two
Yeah, because
different ones.
that was a lot. My brain is spinning.
All right, that's no problem. Then we'll go ahead and you can go ahead and close it out from here. We'll pick it up on the next turnaround. So you go ahead and stop the recording.